Welcome back to Hell to Pay podcast. I'm Elle, and this week we're once again without Armour, but we are very fortunate to have with us
Sipo.
He's so back. We are so back. Armour should be back with us next week. He's still in the wilds of Canada doing his penance, but he has a really cool episode lined up. In the meantime, we will be today talking about the true story behind the anti-abortion movement in the US. So get out the torch under your chin and be prepared to hear about some more really horrible people. Okay, so just a bit of background on abortion in the US. So before World War II, many or probably most evangelicals didn't vote. They saw themselves as above earthly politics. The New Deal coming in the 1930s made them rethink that, as did the post-World War II era, the threat of the godless Reds, the real upswell in pride in America, in American capitalism, and especially as, compared to Russia and Eastern Europe. And that really saw faith leaders begin to find common cause with business leaders.
Do you know what's interesting for me, actually, I've always associated the 18th and 19th century America with these massive revivalist movements and so on. And I always thought that the American evangelical movement came out of those, but then it's interesting that they felt the need to politicize themselves after these enormous social changes, as you say, at the beginning of the 20th century. Do you know why that was particularly the reason, or did those early revival movements just never politicize themselves before and then suddenly change afterwards?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. They were called generally Great Awakenings, and there were several massive ones in history that saw a real upswell in evangelicism. They tended to more, I suppose, have an ethos as opposed to a particular politics. I mean, there certainly were, political people, and I mean, at the time, just everything was so religiously infused in the US. I don't really think you could especially separate secular politics from religious ones, just because everyone grew up in the church, knew the Bible, knew when you made certain allusions to things like that. So it really was as becoming a firm political unit. I mean, also evangelicals or, broadly like Protestants in America, in terms of the ethos, that's always been that strain in America of, freedom from the state, but also that real sense of capitalism, in self-reliance, in the self-made man, in pull yourself up by the boots, in the frontier culture. So if it's not working for you here in this town, just keep going further and further to the edge of the frontier until you make it. So that was certainly always around, and that's they are very political ideas in and of themselves, but in terms of party politics, I mean, I guess you'd say that the Deep South was something of an exception there.
Right,
but as a religious bloc, they didn't really come especially into the fold until after World War II. I mean, of course, there are many exceptions to this, but the modern understanding is that the New Deal really catalyzed them, and then things after World War II just really made the white evangelical bloc as we understand it today.
Interesting.
So on January 23, 1973, abortion was legalized in the United States via the well-known Roe v. Wade case in the Supreme Court. And what's really interesting is that Jerry Falwell, one of the most famous men in America at the time, a very big Baptist, a Southern Baptist preacher figure, he said he was happy with the decision, and it was an issue of personal determination and religious liberty. And he actually said, what is best for the mother and for the future should be allowed.
That is absolutely wild.
It is, right? And this is why I wanted to do this episode, because they've sort of been allowed to rewrite history, but the history is actually even darker and more interesting. And even a year before Roe v. Wade, the Southern Baptist Convention had resolved to press for legislation allowing for abortion in limited cases. But what happened when Roe v. Wade came down was that it sent Catholic conservatives into overdrive. So there was a period of about 6 years where it just wasn't an issue for evangelicals. But in 1979, they made it the social issue around which they would rally. And for them, that's because there was actually quite a different issue that they wanted to to make their own political issue, and abortion wound up being the cover for it. So just a little bit further background on abortion. So it wasn't really an issue, especially before the Civil War. It was just if you had enough money to be able to afford it. Some laws started slowly coming in after the Civil War that outlawed abortion. My guess would be that might just be in relation to we need bodies, the sheer amount of young men that died. I know that there was something like there was a global wood shortage from the Civil War because there were so many caskets that, they chopped down so many trees to make caskets.
That is crazy.
Yeah. And so abortion, was really just a Catholic thing. Evangelicals, traditionally, faith, family, flag types. They always thought the Catholics were a bit weird. Some places, downright hostile to them. Think of like the KKK or the Know Nothings Party. That's, major issue was just anti-Catholicism. Well, not the KKK, obviously, but the Know Nothings.
Yes, yeah.
We're majorly anti-Catholic. And
I only recently found out about the Know Nothings, and what a fascinating time in American history.
Yeah, they were big where I live in Louisiana. So yeah, again, maybe there might be an episode in that one day. And largely the evangelicals, I mean, obviously there's, a lot of historical stuff there, but their issue, I suppose, with modern Catholics, a lot of it was just freedom and the founding of America, and just saying, the government and, by extension, the church shouldn't be allowed into our bedrooms. Just to, put the sort of historical anti-Catholicism into context. It wasn't until JFK in 1960 was the first Catholic president. And even then, he had to spend a pretty fair portion of his campaign trying to just sort of de-Catholicize himself and to stop people being, sort of middle America fearing what these papists were going to do.
I didn't realize myself that he was Catholic. I just thought of him as the Irish and so on because of his dad, but the connection with the his background and this very strong anti-Catholic movement within the United States, I didn't put those two together until very recently. So extraordinary presidency in more than one ways.
Yeah, and like we've been talking a lot about nostalgia and changing societies in our last episode, and when you think of now all the Trump people being obsessed with the JFK assassination, and it is so clearly like this innocence lost moment for the country, and Trump's whole thing is basically, we should just like get back to the 1950s just without unions and, and all that kind of stuff. And then so obviously the JFK assassination is just the end of what they perceive as this golden age of innocence. And just to highlight how much this just was not a conservative evangelical issue. 1967, then California government Ronald Reagan signed into law the most liberal abortion bill in the country.
And with no backlash, no sort of anti-movement about it at all.
Yep, all fine.
Amazing.
Yeah, it was just government can't tell us what to do. Just fairly standard, and probably a little bit of eugenics in there as well. But it was just very much, in the spirit of the times, and California was certainly the place where big social changes were happening. The Summer of Love was just down the road, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, it just cannot overstate just how much abortion just was not really an issue for most Americans at the time. So 1969, Roe v. Wade was brought before the courts by a Texas woman called Norma McCovey, I'm not sure how it's pronounced actually. And she was pregnant for the third time at 21. So she'd had a pretty rough life. She got married at 16, she'd fled domestic violence, and then claimed that she'd been tricked into adopting out a previous child by her mother. She went to some sort of abortion crisis center or something like that. And she was told to say that she'd been raped by black men in order to get an abortion exemption.
Now, was this legal at the time? So in terms of being able to qualify, did you have to quite literally say the most racist thing?
Yeah, so you could get exceptions. So I'm imagining that they were probably your traditional kind of rape and incest and those sorts of things. And I believe that, she was in Texas. So I imagine that the fastest route towards, in the South was just to say, raped by black men. And that seemed to be, I think, a fairly common idea that was.
I mean, that's how Emmett Till was lynched, right? Even though obviously it emerged later that I forget the woman's name, that she lied about the whole thing. But yeah, it was very much that specter of the black men sullying the innocence of our, white women, that whole ideology. I'm sure it wouldn't shock you to know that that was a thing in apartheid as well.
Of course, yeah. I mean, certainly in the US, the hypersexualization of young black men in particular has always been a thing. And I think, yeah, there are still undercurrents to this day. Certainly, I think that would have been seen as a shortcut that for many people would have been preferable to, going to the coat hanger guy in the back alley.
Right, yeah.
But authorities actually didn't accept and didn't give her the exemption. And then she was not able to get an illegal abortion, and she didn't want to adopt out the child. This brought her into the orbit of two female attorneys who were looking for cases to take to the Supreme Court to finally get a national ruling on abortion to legalize it. So it actually took 3 years to get to the Supreme Court for a hearing. So obviously, when you're probably talking weeks or even months, that's not ideal. So Norma had the baby and adopted it out. And actually she'd never even attended the trial. And we'll kind of go into a bit more detail later on, but I think as you can probably gather from her backstory, she was probably not the ideal candidate. When you think about, something that's, it's civil rights in America, everyone knows about Rosa Parks and refusing to move on the bus. And the story is always told about, this tired old black woman saying, no, I'm not getting up. I've been on my feet all day. Rosa Parks was very active in the activist community. She actually did this a couple of years after a 15-year-old girl called Claudette Colvin, who had done the same thing, who had refused to move on a bus and cause this huge ruckus. And then I think shortly after that, she had fallen pregnant, and civil rights movement was really aware that she was, wasn't going to be painted that well. So they really got together and worked out that Rosa Parks was the best candidate and very carefully sort of chose her and chose the moment for her to do that, which, in hindsight, the abortion movement, probably should have done, just for Norma's well-being as much as anything. Okay, so after World War II, there was another bigger issue that was dominating American life, and that was desegregation. So President Truman had brought in integration in 1948 for the military because so many black men had fought so admirably in the war. And also it was just the Soviet Union was constantly taunting America, saying that, shut the fuck up about this human rights stuff when you've got these brave black boys out there dying for you and they can't even drink from the same water fountain.
Wasn't it a huge problem when they were deployed, because the American army was based in the UK, where there were no segregation laws, and so you would get fraternization and also obviously African American soldiers fraternizing with a local white woman. And apparently it caused quite a stink, but not necessarily in the UK, but back home.
Oh, I can imagine.
Yeah.
Just as a sidebar, so in World War II, Australia had a huge troop presence of American troops because the English kind of abandoned us and the Americans came in and helped us sort of, push back the Japanese who were, sort of sweeping through Southeast Asia at the time.
Yeah.
And so, there was a huge American military presence on Australian shores, and the only combat that occurred on Australian soil in World War II was what's known as the Battle of Brisbane. And I think it was about, 3 dead and, a dozen injured. And it was basically a group of Australian soldiers were on leave and they were out on this Saturday night in the city of Brisbane. And they were, trying to pick up girls and stuff. And because so many American soldiers had been around and they seemed so glamorous and exotic that the girls weren't interested in the Australian troops. So they just found the bar where all the American guys were drinking at and just went in with the pool cues and everything and attacked all these American soldiers. just one of those great artifacts of Australian history.
That is too funny, genuinely.
Where were we back in the US? Yeah, and in terms of just soldiers, I think there were certainly some white soldiers that came home and were like, these are my brothers in the trenches, or this guy saved my life. So there was certainly the movement coming from some parts of the white community as well. But obviously it was a hugely contentious movement, and while military desegregation happened relatively quickly, the next issues were housing and education, and they were going to take a lot longer and become a lot more contentious.
Wasn't something something else that was a spillover into the civil rights movement was American soldiers were given, how do you say, concessions or almost like a pension of properties outside the cities, and this is the foundation of the American suburbs. But this goes to white soldiers and black soldiers get nothing. And that obviously causes resentment and then starts people politicizing around this, going, hang on a second, so I can die for this country, but I'm not going to get paid for it. I'm pretty sure I remember reading about like that then, because the civil rights movement bubbles away and then, you get the bus strikes and so on in the 50s and then crescendos in the 60s. So World War II, it changed Europe, but it changed the United States too when everyone comes back home.
Very, very much so. And so the big ruling that basically was starting to enforce desegregation in America was Brown versus Board of Education.
Yes.
So that dropped in 1954. And that was actually a year before Claudette Colvin and Rosa Parks had both done their protests, because, needless to say, the wheels of that were moving pretty slowly. And so Brown versus Board of Education unanimously ruled that racial segregation in public schools is unconstitutional, and it overturned the doctrine that had been in the United States since 1896, which was the separate but equal doctrine, which was obviously bullshit, but, people had pushed that for as long as they can, and it just got to the point where history had sort of made it untenable.
The echoes with the apartheid states are ridiculous. Separate but equal obviously being the foundation for the Bantustans over here.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that they were obviously learning from each other and
absolutely
cribbing ideas. So this all sort of came to a head politically in 1964 with LBJ's Great Society program, which brought in sweeping civil rights reforms. And I mean, if it wasn't for Vietnam, he would probably be considered up there close to Lincoln, I think, for his presidency. But then obviously he went and invaded Vietnam, and what a disaster that was. And so it wasn't until 1969, the first year that desegregation went into effect, that the number of white students enrolled in public schools had dropped from 771 to 28. The following year, that number fell to 0. So what happened was what's known as the white flight, which was that parents, to avoid having to put their children into desegregated schools, basically moved out, formed their own suburbs, and started their own schools. And most of these whites-only schools were Christian, generally, some sort of evangelical Protestant, and they were obtaining tax-exempt status as charitable institutions. And to this day, cities, especially in the South, are really defined by their white flight suburbs. Where I live in New Orleans, for example, until Hurricane Katrina, I think it was 70% black. And there is an area just outside of here called Metairie, which is...
Right.
It would have to be like close to 100% white. And this is one of those classic white flight suburbs. And it's actually where the Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett grew up. And it's just...
snap. Okay.
Yeah. It's all, white picket fences, very kind of homogenous looking... there's big, beautiful school, big, beautiful church, all those sorts of things. And then what was sort of called the inner cities were meant to be left to be, decayed. And that's why, you sort of get cliches around crime in the inner cities and neighborhoods and more sort of tightly bound mixed race and black communities, like having a lot of crime and stuff because of the poverty and everyone's being forced into these areas together while the lovely rich whites just go out into the suburbs and build their new white picket fences.
Yeah, and I mean, this obviously isn't a Southern only phenomenon, because I remember reading somewhere that today the most segregated schools are in New York City.
Yeah, I have no doubt.
Yeah.
That's largely, just defined by how many people are packed in together into Manhattan. And so you can have there'll just be like a 38th Street or something. And, on one side it's these really rich brownstones, and on the other side it's working class people kind of shoved into these crumbling apartment blocks that slumlords like the Trump family and that would just sort of kettle people in.
I thought of these segregated but tightly packed, these segregated but tightly packed cities as a South African only thing, or at least societies that have experienced segregation of that level, until I traveled to New York City, and the difference between majority African American, thus poorer neighborhoods versus the very wealthy ones, sometimes it's a street. So I always find it strange when people come to South Africa and they're so blown away by the fact that a street will separate incredible wealth inequality here, because New York City sure as hell looks like that too.
Yeah, that's one of the things I really noticed when I moved to America, how acutely aware people are of their geography. Like parents will, someone will say to you, oh, don't go beyond this street, like 8th Street, or, everyone sort of knows where the dividing lines are. And I remember an Australian friend asked me a little while ago about, why do people in like American TV and just media and stuff like that always talk about particular blocks and really understand things. And I was like, yeah, it's because it's so embedded in people's minds of where the dividing lines are. And so much of it is racialized, but
of course,
in America, it is often just a sort of income and poverty line as well. Okay, so another court ruling in 1970 denied the tax-exempt status of these white flight schools that became known as segregation academies. So they said, if you want to keep doing them, fine, but you've got to pay taxes on it. Even like Nixon put in laws as well so that the people wouldn't have these tax-exempt segregation academies. And I mean, this is a guy who'd been real tough on crime, law and order kind of guy in his election. He'd always talk about urban crime, which everyone knew what that was code for. And he was obsessed with riots in the inner cities and things like that. But he was also very obsessed with his own status and legacy. And some of his campaign advisors had talked to him about, that he should become the American Disraeli, which meant he'd campaign as a conservative but govern like a liberal. And I think as well, like hot on the heels of LBJ, he wanted to write himself into history. And so he was...
Yeah.
He did have like a weird commitment to upholding some of these social ideas and, even, visiting China, the thing that no Democrat would have been able to do it. But he
at
did
all,
have
yeah.
This weirdly like reformist streak in him. And yeah,
yes, indeed, yeah.
Something
else I just remembered was that the Mormon church had to change quite a lot of its theology around race because it was an overtly racist theology until the 1960s or something like that. And that had to do with having to desegregate Brigham Young University or lose the status that it enjoyed. And I hear that it was very begrudging and black people were made to... They didn't have a black student body until the 2000s. But yeah, it was very much around effectively being forced to desegregate under gunpoint or face incredible financial penalties.
Yeah, so this is all a part of these court cases and laws that were happening at the time. There was resistance on many fronts. Yeah, I mean, Mormons are always going to Mormon. People thought Catholics were weird. Mormons have always been a bit. But yeah, the energy was certainly, came from more mainstream, but it certainly did affect the Utah and the Mormons. So Nixon had brought in his laws and the Supreme Court upheld them. So conservatives and hardcore evangelical Christians who had supported Nixon, a lot of these people had really just come into the Republican tent for him, especially in the South. And they were really pissed off, obviously, that what had been sold to them, Nixon had, to their mind, turned his back on them. These laws, about faith and family and making the decisions for what was best for you, the state was once again intruding. And needless to say, they were not happy. So here's where enters Paul Weyrich. He is the co-founder of the ultra-conservative and very moneyed-up Heritage Foundation, which people might have heard from today, where I think they're involved in Project 2025, that the sort of playbook by which Trump is trying to govern. And they've been around for, I think, since the 70s or maybe even the 60s. But they've just always been around. And I mean, they were supported, by huge billionaire interests. Koch brothers, one of their original funders was Joseph Coors, the beer baron. And so they've always been, the conservative edge of very reactionary, neoliberal, libertarian kind of politics in the US. So Paul Weyrich was actually an intense Catholic. And he was the first person in power and influence in the US, I think, who really saw that Catholics and evangelicals could find a common cause. And he'd sort of made it his personal mission to get evangelicals to become politicized and conservative because they were just such a big and formidable base. And I think, we started seeing with the Goldwater Revolution and then Nixon that they were, white evangelicals were willing to come together, and the way that they swept through and changed the politics of the South, that was a very powerful thing. So Weyrich actually coined the idea of the moral majority, which became the movement that Jerry Falwell led. And he called for Christians of all denominations to rally around this sort of faith-based politics that was heavily coded for all sorts of pushing back all sorts of social changes.
Yeah.
And for 2 decades, Weyrich had been pushing this movement, and he'd been focus group testing all these kind of ideas for how they could get evangelicals into the tent with them. So it was, prayer in schools, which is an eternal issue, but I just don't think, people can get that wound up about it. The horrors of pornography, which was obviously becoming more mainstreamed in the 1970s, and constitutional amendments like equal rights. But they were all kind of, pornography accepted, they were all kind of unsexy kind of topics. And I guess, maybe a bit complex, and they just didn't really have any valence. But then he noticed just how much the desegregation of schools, particularly for white Southern evangelicals, had really, really mobilized them. And the fact that it was the tax department, the IRS, that was doing it was even more enraging. America still has always had that low tax ethos that get the government out of my way. And it was just the right kind of two issues to come together that to really just cause an eruption. But obviously there was still a social awareness that trying to turn back desegregation just wasn't going to fly. Especially even your white Southern evangelicals still wanted to be respectable. They didn't want to look like they were putting their foot on... Yeah, I know.
Imagine a world in which that still matters to sort of look normal to your neighbors.
Yeah, no one wanted to be the guy to say it, And then Weyrich had the very bright idea of polling the sort of, white evangelicals and saying, hey, do you like killing babies? And of course, all these respectable church-going, pearl-clutching people no, that's horrible. How could anyone like killing babies? This is horrific. And so
that's actually really interesting. So this culture of leading questions in polls that, even things like gay rights in America and so on and so on, where they write these polls, and it's obviously always right-wing linked polling groups and think tanks and so on. And then they'll come out and they'll say, Middle America says, and then because the poll says that, then it's almost like the people who answered the question now agree with what they were asked. But it was very leading, and if you actually ask them about direct policy, then suddenly they change their minds. And also in the way that so many, again, Middle America, to use a Nixonian term, all think they hate socialism until you strip away the word and you ask them policy by policy, and they love it.
Absolutely. Yeah. And socialism for me, not for thee.
Yeah.
Okay, so Weyrich has finally found his issue after 2 decades of searching. And so this is where the two issues really come together. So a couple of months after Roe v. Wade was filed in May 1969, a group of African-American parents in a county in Mississippi sued the IRS to prevent 3 of the new whites-only segregation academies from securing the full tax exemption. And obviously, not only were these segregated Christian schools a sort of a big moral and social thing, they were also making shit tons of money. And 2 of the men who owned these schools were particularly appalled by being held to the ruling. So that was Jerry Falwell in Virginia, who I've already mentioned, and a guy called Bob Jones in South Carolina. And Falwell had infamously complained that it's easier to open a massage parlor than a Christian school in some states. So Bob Jones was...
Sorry, I'm just laughing because of Jerry Falwell Jr.'s reputation now, right?
Yeah, the world's greatest fail son. Did you see that Netflix documentary about him?
Yeah, of course.
The camera footage of...
Oh my gosh, the infamous photo with the drink and the ill-fitting shirt and someone else's wife wrapped around his arm.
Yeah, and the pool boy in Miami, and yeah, that's really fun. I cannot recommend it highly enough. And Jerry Falwell was a bit of a weird dude, but when you watch old footage of him, he's really charismatic. And he was a terrible businessman. He was always, his schools, his whole sort of empire out in Lynchburg, Virginia was always being bailed out by someone. But he had a national presence, and his son has just inherited the family farm and is blowing it all up as we speak. So Bob Jones was the other key figure in this, and he was particularly pissed off about it all. But it was Falwell and Weyrich who really came together and who were able to frame their opposition to desegregating schools as an issue of religious freedom rather than a racial issue. Bob Jones, again, people just trying to look like they're with the times. I mean, he tried to employ one black kid part-time at his radio station.
Oh, no.
And needless to say, the poor kid didn't last very long. And then he, so Bob Jones had a Bob Jones University. And then he said, I'm only going to admit married blacks, which, most 18-year-olds going to university aren't married. Yeah. And again, just this whole veneer of respectability. Understanding the importance of that, I think, really goes a long way to understanding American politics, even to today. And so then in January 1976, under the Ford Republican administration, the IRS said, that's it, right? The law is that you have to integrate your schools or you have to pay taxes. And it rescinded Bob Jones University's tax exemption. And so that was seismic. That was, the courts are against us, our own, the people that we voted for are against us. And this was, this was, for a lot of Southern white evangelicals, this was an existential moment. Not only do I not get to be like professionally racist, but we've got to pay taxes for the privilege of doing it. And so, ironically, this ruling happened 1 year and 1 day before Jimmy Carter, who was himself a white Southern evangelical, was elected as a Democratic president. But Weyrich was just really ahead of the game, and he saw this as an opportunity to make this, the desegregation issue a Republican issue under the real guise of religious freedom. They were very keen to cement the gains that Nixon had made in the white South. And so it was sort of win-win for everyone. And so they were really, really invested in mobilizing evangelical voters, but knew that enough of them wanted to be respectable, as we've mentioned, and that they needed this bigger issue. At the same time, Roe v. Wade is obviously bubbling along in the background. And while evangelicals were initially fine with it, it's a weirdo Catholic issue, not our problem, it was also sort of slowly becoming a bit of a public referendum on the sexual revolution and female liberation, which had obviously was something else that was happening at the same time. And needless to say, a lot of these, especially like old white Southern evangelical guys, weren't so happy with women getting their own ideas and entering the workforce and all that kind of stuff. So blacks and women, it can't be happening. And so Weyrich and the Heritage Foundation and this wider movement started to sort of float tying these two ideas together. And there was a Senate election in 1978 where conservative Catholics had gone really hard on the issue and were fairly well rewarded. And this confirmed for Weyrich that this was this giant package of religious liberty, which incorporated anti-abortion stuff with let us do our own schools for our own kids and not pay taxes on them, was really the way to go. So, by this time, we're talking that Roe v. Wade had been legal for 5 years. So if you think what now, like 5 years ago we were all in lockdown for COVID.
Yeah.
So it's a pretty long time. But in the meantime, and what Weyrich and the Heritage Foundation has always been excellent at is your ground game and your mobilizing. And they'd already installed a heap of pro-life candidates and were starting to get them elected across the country. And he was just foaming at the mouth with excitement for this new coalition that he'd put together, and saying, that many of our fringe Christian friends had all come together around this. And, fringe, I think, sort of being the evangelicals that once they probably would have looked down on as your hicks and all of that. And so that 78 election was where Weyrich really got the evangelicals on board. And they were also looking ahead because Ronald Reagan's election was in 1979. And this was really getting the Nixon coalition together, but adding all these bolt-on issues and new voters to become to become, I mean, I suppose what's now known as Reagan Democrats, right? Is getting, the dregs of the South, sort of conservative working class, things like that, to wholly move over to the Republican Party. And then once Reagan got elected, so he came into office in January 1980, started on about the tax department's agenda against independent schools. But interestingly, even then, and I mean, probably a bit, he was always quite happy to contradict himself. But even then, I suppose his social legacy was that he still wasn't really mentioning abortion. But I think the smart thing that the movement did was really let it be, they tried to, the classic astroturfing of a grassroots movement. They really let this movement come from the pews, come from religious leaders, come from communities. And then over time...
Which is incredibly smart. It is actually something that, or maybe we can touch on this a little bit more towards the end, but something that all the other movements, especially the ones that are trying to be progressive and trying to move the United States in a, for lack of a better word, a left-wing direction, trying to base their movements on social media or on just media consumption, which is such a ridiculous misunderstanding of how the right starts off on the grassroots, and then the media diet is a consequence and reinforces what's actually happening on the ground.
Absolutely. Yeah, having these things appear organic, even though, this is, I mean, led by the people that Joseph Coors and, other billionaires are giving all their money to. Yeah. But yeah, so it was by the 1980 election with Reagan that abortion had really become its own thing. And in time, this would, Republicans would all take it on. And now it's just a battle of the bastards to put in the most draconian kind of state laws. There was, especially I think in the 90s and 2000s, there was a fair bit of vigilantism with abortion doctors being murdered. And then over time, I mean, especially under Reagan's administration, it just became this shibboleth of the right that abortion is murder, life, constantly debating at, what point of a, egg and sperm is their life. And just traditionally something that was very much a long-term Catholic issue had just been taken, bastardized, transformed the country, and just became this huge movement that we're still dealing with today.
Incredible.
I know. Yeah, so just wrapping up some of the characters that we have here, everyone kind of knows how the anti-abortion movement just kind of swept through following that. But just interestingly, later in life, Norma McCorvey, who, was the original Roe in the case, became an evangelical and then became a Catholic, and she became a key figure in the anti-abortion movement herself. She would publicly say that her involvement in Roe was the biggest mistake in her life. However, in a documentary made later in her life, she even called it her own deathbed confession. She said that she didn't actually support the anti-abortion movement and she only did it for money.
My God.
Yeah, which is, kind of goes back to what I mentioned earlier, which was like, if you're going to have a person front a movement, you've got to pick your Rosa Parks. You've got to pick your very committed, ideal person.
Yeah.
Because,
that actually, because obviously there's a lot of revisionism now about the civil rights movement, especially from a left perspective, which I find wild. And a lot of it will focus on the Rosa Parks choice and saying, this was respectability politics at the end of the day and so on and so on. But unfortunately, political movements, especially ones that are trying to be broad movement, have to make these terrible choices in the sense of the personalities involved. But it's for the reason that you elucidate now, that unfortunately what's true for the person then has to be true 50 years down the line, and you can't have the person effectively change their minds on you. And I've seen examples of that happening the other way, where like these evangelical firebrands fall off the wagon, so to speak, and then and often they're the most effective people at talking about what actually happens behind the scenes in these churches and so on and so on.
Yeah. Just a couple of final postscripts. So the Bob Jones University case, he went to appeal it at the Supreme Court in 1982, and the Reagan administration, on their new coalition, was just like, right, we'll go straight in and we'll defend it, defend the university and their racial policies against the wicked evil tax department. But actually the public outcry to that was so much that they backed down. And I think this is where we really see it become, once again, that great expression, states' rights issue. And so they were just sort of saying, as, your national figure, your commander-in-chief, he was essentially a sort of a regal figure that everyone loved in America. And Reagan was very good at doing your dog whistles about your welfare queens and things like that. He did have enough sense, I think, to say, I don't want to be the guy kind of lumbered with this. And so it was farmed out to the states and became the new states' rights issue, which again is so coded in racial history that people understand what it means. And it was able to maintain that nexus of the abortion movement and racial politics. And then, but Roe v. Wade was still in place until June 2022, when after Ruth Bader Ginsburg's death, the right was able to stack the Supreme Court and overturn the decision. Yeah, today, we're seeing, teenage girls die of septicemia and...
My God, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I live in the South, discussing with my friends after the election, what our kind of plan was, if we ever needed, some sort of Planned Parenthood care. Most of us are lucky that we can jump on a flight to Mexico, but yeah.
Right, is Louisiana one of those?
Yeah, Louisiana's to the right out of Genghis Khan. We've got our governor, Jeff Landry, is sort of trying to be the new Ron DeSantis. And he's bringing the 10 Commandments in school classrooms bill. He was the first to introduce that. Basically, it was, I think, his first action once he got elected last year. And he wants to be a national figure because any sort of 10 Commandments in the classroom is going straight to the Supreme Court. And he wants to be the guy. You're going to be hearing a lot more about him. Unfortunately, Louisiana is a very red state, and they were, very quick to introduce all those sorts of draconian laws down here.
So is Louisiana also one of those where if you are found to have traveled to another state for an abortion, then it's they're trying to make that illegal?
Yeah, I believe so. I don't think we've had any cases here, but I think... you are testing me here.
How does that gel with the whole states' rights approach though, right?
Well,
if I fly to California, who cares what Texas thinks of that or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, it's rights for thee, not for me. Actually, Louisiana does have a case, I think that's going to be in court soon, where a teenage girl got abortion pills from a doctor in New York, who is like an activist, sort of women's rights doctor, and who I think prescribed them over telehealth, which is a really common thing here now, and then sent them down. So I think that they're both on the hook. I actually haven't followed up for a while because, as you can see, America's a madhouse at the moment and there's something new each day. Yeah. But I think that is going to be a big court decision that's coming up, and it is going to test that. Yeah.
Wow. So actually one more question from my side. So obviously the evangelical movement, at least several parts of it glom themselves onto MAGA and onto Trump, which I always found bizarre because I thought that MAGA was very conspiracy driven in a way that didn't necessarily rhyme with the evangelical movement. And that by that I mean it seemed to be so QAnon, for example, right, being a huge part of it. That's not really a church thing. But now they've completely chucked themselves behind him. And I guess they got what they wanted in terms of Roe versus Wade getting overturned. But what comes next? I don't, especially say if Trump continues to make his presidency about things that don't necessarily matter to them. And secondly, if Trump continues to harm their interests as directly as he's doing. Like, what comes next? Do you think it fractures now? Do you think it depoliticizes? Do you think they find another Trump? I mean, it can't be J.D. Vance. Even they must know that guy's a pretend Christian.
Yeah, so, I mean, look, I think the best explanation about why evangelicals got so far behind Trump and so quickly, I mean, firstly, it was the charismatic Pentecostals that were behind him in Paula White Cain. When he was a joke candidate. And I think part of that was like was style, as much as, it's the, kind of doing a stand-up routine on stage, it's getting the crowd involved, it's, sensing a waning audience, all that stuff that is very, very rooted in the Pentecostal charismatic tradition. But I think that more importantly on the issues of substance. My friend David Smith, who's a professor in American Studies at Sydney University, he's been saying for, since 2016 that evangelicals love Trump because he's not constrained by their morality. So he'll do their bidding. So from the very beginning when he got in, evangelicals were calling him their King Cyrus. So, the biblical king who freed the Jews and, or, at least protected them.
Right, yeah.
And so that's always been the thing. And it's like, well, yeah, he's, the divorces, some of the, respectability politics are a bit off. But, he's going to do the stuff that we want. And, he even said that quite explicitly when he moved, one of his first things was moving the American embassy in Israel to Jerusalem from Tel Aviv. And, no one does that because it's insane and it could inflame tensions.
Yeah.
And even the Israelis didn't really want it or care that much about it. I mean, some hardcore dudes would have, but it wasn't a huge issue for them. And Trump gave like a speech to a Jewish audience and he's like, oh yeah, I did that for the evangelicals. They're really into that for some reason.
Yes, I think I remember that one.
Not for you guys.
God, because of the whole oh God, I'm going to get that word. Millenarial end of world prophecy thing, which is also in of itself a fringe, or at least a part of the evangelical movement. The whole idea that we need... the church I grew up in literally believes that all the Jews have to be herded into Israel so that the prophecy can be fulfilled, and they genuinely believe that the end of the world moment when Jesus comes is when all Jewish people on earth will be killed in one go. I mean,
there's actually I might do an episode on it sometime, just the sort of changing currents of Christian Zionism, because it's really fascinating. It wasn't really until probably really until the 70s and 80s that Christians, they were largely anti-Semites before that.
Yes, big time.
Yeah.
The whole Judeo-Christian talking point is complete nonsense. It's something that was invented by whoever in the 1990s.
Yeah,
it was never a thing.
I think it went back to FDR, but that was more as a part of his getting everyone in the tent for big changes, going into World War II not excuse, but for the, it was part of the justification for entering World War II.
Yeah.
It was really started to be popularized again in the 70s. And so evangelicals are very much in the Trump tent. And I mean, it's also, some of the other stuff that we've been talking about, like the false nostalgia that Trump, really plays into. And there is a lot of that in evangelical communities that is pretending back to a better time, because, I mean, people just can't, people aren't able to pass this massive decline in living standards that we're beginning to see, the ever increasing inequality, things like that in the States. And so, rather than doing anything about material and even spiritual conditions, everyone's just going into this world of false nostalgia.
Yeah, and QAnon style, understanding politics purely as a conspiracy theory, right? Complete detachment from reality and materialism, as you say.
Yeah, there's an academic, I think it was in Trump 1, wrote a book, and I can't remember, I think it's her name or what it's actually called, but she kind of came up with the idea that part of Trump's appeal and his sort of almost a crutch that he uses is conspiracies without the theories. He's like, often common line is
that's good.
So like everyone's talking about, everyone's wondering, and then he'll just float something out there, but doesn't actually have this complex jet fuel can't melt steel beams understanding of the whole thing. So it's just like, JFK got assassinated, and we never, there were some question marks about the guy who did that. Isn't that weird? Or now, we're seeing with the the RFK on about autism. I mean, just almost any issue that Trump picks up, there is like some sort of ill-defined conspiracy, and I think he's kind of found the loophole to not sound like a complete crank. It's just, haven't you ever it's sort of almost the Jerry Seinfeldication of politics, which is like, have you ever wondered about this thing? And it's like, oh, you kind of
heard about this, folks?
Yeah.
More and more people are saying it.
Yeah, exactly. You're hearing it more and more. And that kind of comes into his whole outlook on the world.
Incredible.
Yeah. So, I mean, it would be nice to do a podcast which doesn't just end in me saying it's all so grim, but it is also grim.
Unfortunately, with the broad subject matter we've chosen, it's going to be a while before we found a topic where we go. And then they changed everything for the better. We should actually set that as a purposeful challenge to kind of find a really hopeful, good story.
Yeah, I think we should have a new tagline. If you don't laugh, you'll cry.
Yeah. Listeners, that's a challenge for you. Find us a story to talk about. It isn't like it's super depressing.
Yeah. Okay, well, thanks again, everyone, for joining us. And we'll be back next week with some more interesting stories. And just remember to leave a review, tell your friends, do what you can if you like the show, and we hope to be able to keep it going for a long time.
Awesome.